This story was performed as part of My So-Called Jewish Life, an annual partnership between Story District and 6th and I in Washington, D.C.
All right, well, we got a great show for you tonight, and these storytellers have been working very hard on these stories. So please, let's give a lot of extra love. It's always hard to be the first one. Extra love for Cody Pomerantz.
So one night, when I was in college, I was a junior in college, my girlfriend at the time asked me if I felt certain that we were going to stay together through graduation and get married. I didn't know my answer to that question, so she dumped me. I was heartbroken. I mean, this was my first serious girlfriend. It was the first girl I'd introduced to my family, the first girl I'd slept with, the first girl I'd disappointed in bed. You never forget your first. But we had been dating for 2.5 years, and we had started dating our first month of college. So our whole worlds had revolved around each other, and I couldn't remember what life had been like without her. I'd never experienced that shock of going from being so in love to so alone, and it broke me. I stopped going to class. I stopped going out on the weekends. I did this really masochistic thing where I listened to old voicemails that she had left me just so I could hear her again. And when I finally felt like I hit rock bottom, I got an email saying that a spot had opened up on the spring break trip to Birthright in Israel. Now, I thought this was a chance for me to escape, to, go on an adventure, my own Jewish version of Eat, Pray, Love. I thought, worked for Julia Roberts, it could work for me. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar about Birthright, there's 2 reasons students typically go on this trip: to get in touch with their Jewish heritage or to get laid. That second reason is the primary motivator. It's like those stories you hear about the Olympic Village being an orgy for people with superhuman athleticism. Birthright is an orgy for people with superhuman anxiety. And the organizers fully encouraged this idea. In fact, in the very first conversation we had with our guide, he talked about all of the married couples who had met on his trip. He reminded us how few Jews there are in the world, and how someone needed to make more of them. It's real subtle. I felt like I needed to be prepared for this, so the night before the trip, I went out and bought a giant box of condoms, which is very different from a box of giant condoms. Stay with me. But the first thing I did was I put one in my wallet, because, I don't know, for emergencies, I thought that was something you did, like a AAA card for sex. And the next morning, we were going through airport security, and when I went through the metal detector, I had forgotten to take my wallet out of my pocket, and it beeped. And the TSA agent said, take your wallet out, put it on the table. She said, what do you have in there? And I said, it's just cash and a credit card, maybe a few coins. She waved her wand over it, and it beeped again. She picked it up and opened it, and the first thing that she pulled out was a thin piece of Trojan aluminum. She held it up for everybody in the line to see. She looked at me, and she smiled, and she said, well, aren't you prepared? I said, I'm really sorry, I'm newly single. It was an optimistic purchase. So I was off to a great start on this trip, and after my airport humiliation and an 11-hour flight, we arrived in the Holy Land, and we met the 8 Israeli soldiers who would be accompanying us on the trip. The first soldier to get on the bus was Nitzan, who started walking down the aisle, high-fiving everyone and saying, let's get hard tonight, which we later found out was him trying to say, let's go hard tonight. The second soldier to get on the bus was Deckel. Deckel was assigned to be my roommate, and Deckel looked like a male model. I mean, he was 6'2" and had a six-pack. When Deckel got on the bus, the girls on our trip were looking at him like, we didn't know Jews came in these shapes and sizes. They don't have these back home. Can we stay here? But I knew right away that Deckel and I would get along because we did have some things in common. I mean, I was 22, he was 22, I'm half Greek, he's half Greek god. It was a perfect match. But then the soldier goddesses got on the bus, and one of them sat next to me. She had a name tag with the letters M-O-R. I thought I could impress her with my bar mitzvah level Hebrew. I said, "It's nice to meet you, Moch." And she started laughing hysterically, and I couldn't understand why. And then she looked at me and smiled, and she said, "It's just more, there's no ch." Now, I'm not often speechless, but at that moment I was at a loss. I mean, she had these mesmerizing green eyes that matched the color of her army uniform. And she had this laugh that just made me want to keep mispronouncing her name so I could hear it again. And I won't say that her smile could bring peace to the Middle East, but it would certainly have a better shot than Jared Kushner. But I felt this pang of guilt that comes when you're infatuated with someone new, but you're still in love with someone else, and I felt like I was still in love with my ex-girlfriend. But I wanted to impress more, and I was going to look for any chance to do it. Unfortunately, when I looked at the itinerary, it was like they had custom designed the trip to show me at my worst. I mean, one of the first things that they did was take us to the Dead Sea and put us in our bathing suits. And I've never been known for my athletic physique. I mean, this Fitbit is for fashion. In middle school, my track time was 7 minutes and 58 seconds for a half mile. There's a reason it took us 40 years to get through the desert. So this was not like my top game is to go shirtless at the Dead Sea. But we did this tourist custom, if you've ever been to the Dead Sea, where you rub your body in this magical mud that makes your skin glow. Now, if you're currently imagining me without a shirt caked in mud, I'm sorry. If you're currently imagining Deckel without a shirt caked in mud, you're welcome. But it just got worse from there. I mean, they had us put on goggles and flippers to go snorkeling, which made me look stupid, and they had us play ultimate frisbee, which made everyone look stupid. Meanwhile, my giant box of condoms was coming in handy for other people. I mean, after the TSA agent had so kindly advertised what I had in my bag at the airport, everybody knew, and so on the way to the desert, my friends asked me for some. And then the soldiers started asking me for condoms, which is the only time anyone in a military uniform has asked me for protection. Now, when we got to the desert, the first thing we did was the traditional Birthright camel ride. My camel's name was Joanne. And this was when I had the bright idea to try and impress more by taking my hands off of the handlebar that was attached to the saddle. And that's exactly when Joanne decided to dip her head down and throw me off her flank. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been thrown off of a camel in front of a beautiful woman before, but it's not ideal. I'm lying there underneath a camel. She doesn't smell great. And I'm covered in sweat. I don't smell great either. And I'm thinking about how I've mispronounced Moore's name, how I've covered myself in mud in front of her, how all of the optimistic condoms I bought are gone, and how the only female I've had physical contact with was Joanne, who made it very clear she didn't like me. All I can think is I'm missing my ex-girlfriend, and why did I go on this trip? And Julia Roberts from Eat, Pray, Love lied to me. And that's when Moore and Deckel came over and helped me up, and I brushed the sand off and got back on Joanne, and we trotted along. After we got back to the campsite, Moore and I started to talk to each other about our lives. She told me about the army, and I told her about my grandfather, who was a Jewish POW in Germany in World War II. I told her my best jokes, and she taught me how to say dirty words in Hebrew. I even told her about my ex-girlfriend, the one woman who had fallen in love with me. And she told me about the many men who had fallen in love with her. For the first time in what seemed like eternity, I felt like I was connecting with someone again. We made our final stop at Mount Herzl Plaza, which overlooks Jerusalem. We got there around the time the sun was setting. As we were looking out at the views, our guide quoted a famous Israeli author who wrote that Jerusalem is a city that has been destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt again. In his mind, our guide said, that made it like the heart of the world. Then he told us that the plaza we were standing in was the site of the official ceremony for Israel's two most important holidays, Memorial Day and Independence Day, which immediately follows. Every year, the most somber day on the Israeli calendar is followed by the most joyous one. And that's when Moore leaned over to me and said, "This is what it means to be Israeli. We can mourn what we've lost and then revel in what it means to be alive. We can feel destroyed and then learn to rebuild. We can fall off a camel and then get back on it." Before we went to the airport for our flight home, we made our final goodbyes to the soldiers, and Deckel offered me some workout tips. Nitzan told me to keep getting hard back home. And finally, Moore came over with something in her hand. It was her army name tag, the same one I'd seen when I'd first met her and horribly mispronounced her name. And she leaned down, she kissed me on the cheek, and pinned the name tag on my shirt. And she said, "This is for you, Chodi." Which I thought was sweet. When I got back to the States, I finally deleted all those old voicemails I'd been saving. I started going out again, going back to class, reveling in my life. I didn't find a new girlfriend in Israel, but I did start to get over my old one. I finally made it back to that steady space between love and loneliness. I've been back to Israel once since, this summer actually. I still keep in touch with Moore and Deckel and Nitzan on Facebook. And while she never calls or writes, I like to believe Joanne still thinks of me from time to time. Thank you.